May 3rd, 1977, Mexicana Airlines. Flight 576 is cruising at 30,000 feet when something impossible happens. Captain Rafael Pacheco, a seasoned pilot with over 15,000 flight hours, suddenly stops being himself. His voice changes, his words aren't his own, and for the next 20 minutes, every passenger on board watches in terror as their captain becomes a human microphone for something not of this world. This isn't another blurry UFO photo or distant light story. This is the most documented alien hijacking in aviation history, recorded by air traffic control, witnessed by an entire plane full of passengers, and covered up by authorities for over 40 years. Welcome to Arcade Recaps. Tonight, you'll learn what that alien intelligence said through the captain's mouth, and you'll understand why aviation authorities have buried this case for nearly half a century. Because what happened on Flight 576 proves we're not alone, and worse, they can take control of us anytime they want. Before we dive into what happened that terrifying afternoon over central Mexico, you need to understand who Rafael Pacheco was. Because when skeptics try to dismiss this case, they always start by attacking the credibility of the witness. But Captain Pacheco wasn't some amateur pilot prone to hallucinations or attention-seeking behavior. He was a decorated veteran of Mexican aviation, with a spotless record spanning over 2 decades. Pacheco began his flying career in the Mexican Air Force, where he earned commendations for his precision and reliability. After his military service, he transitioned to commercial aviation and quickly rose through the ranks at Mexicana Airlines. By 1977, he was one of their most trusted captains, regularly flying the challenging mountain routes that connect Mexico City with the coastal regions. His fellow pilots described him as methodical, calm under pressure, and absolutely unflappable in emergency situations. On the morning of May 3rd, 1977, Captain Pacheco reported for duty at Mexico City International Airport for what should have been a routine flight to Acapulco. Flight 576 was a regularly scheduled service that Pacheco had flown hundreds of times before. The weather was clear, the aircraft was in perfect condition, and the passenger manifest showed 87 souls on board, including crew. The aircraft was a Boeing 727, tail number XASEL, a workhorse of commercial aviation known for its reliability and safety record. First Officer Miguel Torres, who had flown with Pacheco on dozens of previous flights, later described the pre-flight routine as completely normal. All systems checked out perfectly, communication equipment was functioning flawlessly, and both pilots felt confident about the 2-hour journey ahead. What makes this case so compelling is the sheer amount of documentation that exists. Unlike most UFO encounters that rely on witness testimony alone, the Pacheco incident was captured by multiple recording devices, witnessed by trained aviation professionals, and documented in official reports that I've managed to obtain through contacts in the Mexican aviation industry. Flight 576 departed Mexico City at 2:15 p.m. local time, climbing smoothly to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. For the first hour and 20 minutes of the flight, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The passengers were settling in for the journey, the flight attendants were beginning their service, and Captain Pacheco was maintaining his usual professional demeanor on the flight deck. But at approximately 3:35 p.m., as the aircraft was passing over the mountainous region between Mexico City and Acapulco, something extraordinary began to unfold. According to the cockpit voice recorder, which was later analyzed by aviation authorities, Captain Pacheco's voice suddenly changed mid-sentence while communicating with air traffic control. First Officer Torres later testified that Pacheco had been responding to a routine altitude check from Mexico City Center when his voice dropped to an unnaturally low register. The words coming from his mouth were in Spanish, but the cadence, the tone, and even the vocabulary were completely unlike the captain he had known for years. The air traffic controller at Mexico City Center, Carlos Mendoza, was the first to notice something was wrong. In a 1995 interview that was never made public until now, Mendoza recalled that Captain Pacheco's voice sounded, quote, like someone else was speaking through him. The words were clear, but it wasn't the pilot I had been talking to just moments before. What happened next would turn Flight 576 from a routine commercial flight into the most documented case of alleged extraterrestrial contact in aviation history. According to the cockpit voice recorder transcript, which I've obtained from a source within the Mexican Department of Civil Aviation, Captain Pacheco began speaking in that altered voice, delivering a message that would chill everyone who heard it. The transcript shows that at 3:37 p.m., Captain Pacheco's voice, now described by witnesses as mechanical and emotionless, began transmitting on the emergency frequency. But he wasn't declaring a mechanical emergency or requesting assistance. Instead, he was delivering what can only be described as a message from something not of this world. First Officer Torres later testified that during this transmission, Captain Pacheco's eyes remained open, but his expression was completely blank. His hands remained on the controls, but Torres could see that Pacheco wasn't consciously flying the aircraft. Even more disturbing, when Torres tried to get Pacheco's attention by calling his name and even physically touching his shoulder, there was no response whatsoever. The passengers in the cabin began to notice something was wrong when the aircraft started making subtle course corrections that weren't part of the planned flight path. Several passengers later reported feeling an unusual vibration through the aircraft, not mechanical, but almost like an electrical charge in the air. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez, who had worked with Captain Pacheco for over 5 years, noticed the change in the cockpit atmosphere immediately. In a sworn statement given to investigators 3 days after the incident, Gonzalez described an overwhelming sense of presence in the aircraft, as if something invisible but massive had joined them in flight. She reported that the cabin lights flickered intermittently, electronic devices like watches and calculators began malfunctioning, and several passengers complained of headaches and nausea that came on suddenly and intensely. But the most disturbing aspect of the entire event was what Captain Pacheco was saying during those 17 minutes when something else appeared to be in control of his voice. The message, delivered in that flat, mechanical tone, contained information that no human pilot should have known, predictions about future events that would later prove accurate, and technical details about aircraft systems that exceeded even Pacheco's extensive knowledge. According to the transcript, the entity speaking through Captain Pacheco identified itself as representing a collective intelligence that had been observing human aviation development for decades. It claimed responsibility for several unexplained aviation incidents, including mysterious equipment failures and course deviations that had puzzled investigators for years. More chilling was the entity's apparent knowledge of specific details about Flight 576 itself. It referenced the exact fuel load, the precise weight distribution of cargo, the maintenance history of the aircraft, and even personal information about crew members that would have been impossible for anyone outside the airline to know. Air traffic controllers at 3 different facilities, Mexico City Center, Acapulco Approach, and Guadalajara Control, all recorded portions of Captain Pacheco's transmissions during this period. What makes these recordings so significant is that they capture not just the words being spoken, but also background sounds that don't match anything that should have been present in the cockpit of a Boeing 727. Audio analysis conducted years later by acoustic specialists revealed a low-frequency humming sound underlying Pacheco's voice, a frequency pattern that doesn't match any known aircraft system or atmospheric phenomenon. Even more puzzling, spectral analysis of the recording shows harmonic patterns that suggest the sound was being generated by something with a fundamentally different structure than human vocal cords. The entity speaking through Captain Pacheco also demonstrated knowledge of air traffic control procedures and protocols that went far beyond what any pilot would know. It referenced specific radar tracking methods, controller workload management systems, and even classified communication frequencies that were supposedly known only to military aviation authorities. During the 17-minute period, when Captain Pacheco appeared to be under outside control, the aircraft's flight path was altered in ways that defied both physics and aviation regulations. According to radar tracking data from multiple ground stations, Flight 576 made a series of course changes that would have required G-forces exceeding the structural limits of the Boeing 727. Yet passengers and crew reported feeling no unusual motion or stress during these maneuvers. The radar operators who were tracking the flight later described seeing the aircraft's radar signature behave in ways they had never witnessed before or since. At times, the return signal would intensify far beyond normal parameters, then fade to barely detectable levels, all while the aircraft remained in clear weather with no atmospheric interference. Lieutenant Colonel Eduardo Ramirez, who was serving as a radar supervisor at Mexico City Center that day, provided a detailed technical report that was classified immediately after submission. In that report, which was leaked to researchers in the 1990s, Ramirez described radar contacts that appeared to be pacing Flight 576 at distances and altitudes that should have been impossible for any known aircraft to maintain. According to Ramirez's report, these additional contacts moved in perfect synchronization with Flight 576's unusual course changes, suggesting a level of coordination that implied direct communication or control. Most disturbing was his observation that these contacts would appear and disappear from radar screens in ways that violated the basic principles of how radar systems detect and track objects. What happened next would transform this already extraordinary event into something that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The entity, speaking through Captain Pacheco, began making specific predictions about future aviation incidents, technological developments, and global events that would unfold over the coming decades. These weren't vague prophecies that could be interpreted multiple ways. They were precise, detailed forecasts that included dates, locations, and specific individuals who would be involved in future events. Aviation authorities who reviewed these predictions were so disturbed by their accuracy that most of the documentation was immediately classified at the highest levels. But we're just getting started with this incredible case. What I've shared with you so far is only the beginning of a story that gets more unbelievable with each new detail. In the next part of this investigation, we'll explore exactly what those predictions contained, how many of them have come true with terrifying accuracy, and why the Mexican government has spent over 4 decades trying to bury this case. We'll also examine the physical evidence that was collected from the aircraft after it finally landed, evidence that included trace materials that didn't match any known earthly elements, electromagnetic signatures that baffled scientists, and biological samples that suggested something had physically interacted with the aircraft's interior systems. Most importantly, we'll reveal the complete transcript of what the entity said through Captain Pacheco, including the warnings it gave about humanity's future and the specific instructions it provided for contact protocols the governments around the world have been secretly implementing ever since. But before we dive into those earth-shattering predictions and the cover-up that followed, you need to understand what was happening inside the cabin of Flight 576 during those 17 minutes of terror. Because while Captain Pacheco was being used as a conduit for something beyond human comprehension, the passengers were experiencing their own nightmare at 35,000 feet. Passenger testimonies, collected immediately after landing but suppressed for decades, paint a picture of an aircraft cabin that had become something out of science fiction. Elena Vasquez, a schoolteacher from Puebla who was traveling to visit her sister in Acapulco, described the moment she realized something was fundamentally wrong with their flight. According to Vasquez, it started with the silence. Commercial aircraft at cruising altitude maintain a constant background noise from engines, air conditioning, and the subtle sounds of normal flight operations. But around 3:35 p.m., she noticed that all these familiar sounds seemed to fade away, replaced by what she described as an oppressive quiet that made her ears feel like they were stuffed with cotton. Then came the electrical anomalies. Passengers' watches began running backward. Digital calculators displayed impossible numbers. The overhead reading lights would dim and brighten in sequence, creating patterns that seemed almost like a form of communication. Several passengers reported that their jewelry, particularly anything made of metal, became uncomfortably warm to the touch. But it was businessman Jorge Hernandez who noticed the most disturbing change. Hernandez, who traveled frequently for his import business and was familiar with normal flight patterns, realized that the aircraft's movement through the air had become completely unnatural. Looking out his window, he could see clouds and terrain features, but they weren't moving past the aircraft in the way they should have been. Instead, the landscape below appeared to be sliding sideways, as if Flight 576 was moving in directions that defied the basic physics of how aircraft operate. Hernandez later testified that at one point, he was certain the aircraft was flying backward, though he felt no sensation of deceleration or course change that should have accompanied such a maneuver. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez was dealing with increasingly panicked passengers while trying to understand what was happening in the cockpit. Her training had prepared her for mechanical emergencies, medical situations, and even security threats. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she was witnessing aboard Flight 576. Gonzalez later described attempting to contact the flight deck through the intercom system, but instead of Captain Pacheco's familiar voice, she heard that same mechanical, emotionless tone that air traffic controllers were recording on the emergency frequency. When she tried to physically access the cockpit, she found the door wouldn't respond to her key code, even though the locking mechanism appeared to be functioning normally. Several passengers became physically ill during this period, but not from motion sickness or turbulence. Dr. Patricia Morales, a physician who was aboard Flight 576, later provided medical testimony about the symptoms she observed. Passengers complained of severe headaches that came on suddenly and intensely, accompanied by a metallic taste in their mouths, and a sensation she described as feeling like their thoughts were being pulled out of their heads. Dr. Morales attempted to treat these symptoms with standard medications from the aircraft's medical kit, but nothing provided relief. Even more puzzling, she noticed that her own medical instruments, including a simple stethoscope and blood pressure cuff, were producing readings that made no physiological sense. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, first of this nightmare, according Officer Torres was experiencing his own version to his testimony, which was sealed by aviation authorities until a leak in 2003, Torres found himself unable to take control of the aircraft despite it to do so. Every time being fully qualified and authorized, he attempted to override Captain Pacheco's control inputs. His hands would simply freeze on the controls. Torres described this paralysis as unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't that he couldn't move his hands, but rather that something was preventing him from making the specific movements needed to take control of the aircraft. He could reach for his coffee cup, adjust his headset, or write notes. But the moment he tried to touch the flight controls or radio equipment, his muscles would simply stop responding. Even more disturbing was what Torres observed about Captain Pacheco's condition during this period. Pacheco's eyes remained open and appeared alert, but they didn't track movement or respond to visual stimuli. His breathing was regular but abnormally shallow. Most unnervingly, Torres noticed that Pacheco wasn't blinking at the normal rate, sometimes going several minutes without blinking at all. The entity speaking through Captain Pacheco seemed to be aware of Torres's observations and attempts to regain control. At one point, according to the cockpit voice recorder transcript, the mechanical voice addressed Torres directly, using his full name and service number, information that wasn't displayed anywhere in the cockpit, and that Captain Pacheco shouldn't have had memorized. The message delivered to Torres was both reassuring and terrifying. The entity explained that no harm would come to the aircraft or its occupants, but that this demonstration was necessary to establish communication protocols for future contact. It referenced Torres's military background, his flight training records, and even personal details about his family that were not part of any official aviation documentation. Air traffic control centers across Mexico were scrambling to understand what was happening with Flight 576. The aircraft was responding to radio communications, but the responses were coming from someone who clearly wasn't the Captain Rafael Pacheco they knew. Controllers at Mexico City Center attempted to verify the pilot's identity by asking personal questions that only Pacheco would know. But the mechanical voice provided answers with a level of detail that exceeded even what the real Pacheco might have remembered. The entity demonstrated knowledge of Pacheco's complete flight history, including specific incidents and routes from years earlier that weren't part of any central database. It referenced conversations Pacheco had with other pilots, maintenance issues with aircraft he had flown months or years previously, and even details about his family life that he had never shared in professional settings. Carlos Mendoza, the air traffic controller who first noticed the change in Pacheco's voice, later described feeling like he was communicating with a massive intelligence that was accessing information from sources far beyond what any individual human could know. The entity would answer questions before Mendoza finished asking them, and would provide information that Mendoza hadn't requested, but that was exactly what he needed to know. At 3:42 p.m., the entity speaking through Captain Pacheco began delivering what can only be described as a technical lecture on advanced propulsion systems. The transcript shows detailed explanations of physics concepts that wouldn't be publicly understood for decades, mathematical formulas that university professors later confirmed were correct, but had never been published in any academic literature, and engineering principles that aerospace companies are only now beginning to explore. This wasn't just impressive, it was impossible. Captain Pacheco, despite his extensive aviation experience, had no background in theoretical physics or advanced aerospace engineering. The concepts being explained through his voice required knowledge that didn't exist in any human educational institution at the time. Dr. Miguel Santos, a physicist from the National University of Mexico who was secretly brought in to analyze the technical content of these transmissions, later wrote in a classified report that the mathematical relationships described were not only correct, but represented breakthrough thinking that was decades ahead of current scientific understanding. The entity also demonstrated intimate knowledge of other aircraft operating in Mexican airspace that day. It provided precise location data for flights that weren't visible on radar, predicted course changes that other pilots would make minutes before they made them, and even warned controllers about weather conditions that meteorological services hadn't yet detected. At 3:47 p.m., something even more extraordinary occurred. The entity speaking through Captain Pacheco began transmitting on multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, a physical impossibility given the aircraft's communication equipment. Air traffic controllers at different facilities, hundreds of miles apart, were all receiving the same transmission at the same time, but with subtle variations in content that seemed tailored to each specific location. The technical staff at Mexico City Center confirmed that Flight 576's radio equipment was only capable of transmitting on one frequency at a time, yet they were monitoring communications on emergency frequencies, military channels, and civilian air traffic control frequencies, all carrying the same voice with the same timestamp, but different information content. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez later testified that during this period, his radar facility was tracking Flight 576 in a position that was simultaneously confirmed by radar installations in Guadalajara and Acapulco, despite the fact that the aircraft couldn't possibly be visible to all three facilities at once given the curvature of the Earth and the limitations of radar technology. The entity began describing what it called preparation protocols, detailed procedures that aviation authorities should implement for future contact events. These protocols included specific radio frequencies that should be monitored, flight path modifications that would indicate cooperative contact, and even personnel selection criteria for pilots who would be deemed suitable for communication. Most disturbing was the entity's apparent knowledge of classified military installations and restricted airspace throughout Mexico and Central America. It referenced specific radar capabilities, communication protocols, and security procedures that were known only to high-ranking military officials and intelligence personnel. The Mexican Air Force was secretly monitoring these transmissions, and their analysis revealed that the entity had access to information that suggested surveillance of military operations going back several years. Flight patterns, training exercises, and equipment deployments that had never been publicly disclosed were referenced with casual accuracy. At 3:51 p.m., the entity delivered what investigators later called the assessment phase of its message. Speaking through Captain Pacheco, It provided detailed evaluations of human aviation technology, identifying specific weaknesses in aircraft design, air traffic control systems, and safety protocols that wouldn't be discovered by human engineers for years to come. Some of these assessments proved prophetic. The entity warned about metal fatigue issues in certain aircraft models that would later result in tragic accidents. It identified communication vulnerabilities that would eventually be exploited in security breaches. It even predicted specific technological developments that aerospace companies were secretly researching but hadn't yet announced. The passengers aboard Flight 576 were now experiencing effects that went far beyond the initial electrical anomalies and physical discomfort. Several witnesses later described a sensation of shared consciousness, as if the thoughts and emotions of everyone aboard the aircraft were somehow interconnected. Elena Vasquez testified that during the final minutes of the incident, she found herself aware of the fears and concerns of passengers she had never spoken to. She knew that the businessman in seat 12A was worried about missing his daughter's birthday party. She was somehow conscious that the elderly woman across the aisle was thinking about her late husband. These weren't guesses or assumptions, but clear, specific knowledge that she couldn't explain. Dr. Morales observed similar phenomena among other passengers and began documenting what she could only describe as telepathic connections. Passengers were finishing each other's sentences, responding to unspoken questions, and displaying knowledge about each other that they couldn't have acquired through normal interaction. The flight attendants reported that passenger service became almost automatic. They found themselves knowing exactly what each passenger needed before being asked, delivering drinks and snacks to people who hadn't made requests, and providing comfort to passengers who were experiencing distress before those passengers had shown any outward signs of their emotional state. But the most profound change was in the aircraft's relationship to the physical environment around it. Multiple witnesses testified that Flight 576 seemed to be moving through the air without actually displacing it. There was no wind noise, no vibration from air passing over the control surfaces, and no sensation of the aircraft pushing through atmospheric resistance. Jorge Hernandez, the experienced business traveler, later described looking out his window and seeing other aircraft in the distance that appeared to be struggling through heavy turbulence, while Flight 576 moved smoothly through the same airspace. It was as if their aircraft existed in a different version of the same sky. The entity speaking through Captain Pacheco seemed to be building towards some kind of climactic revelation. Its mechanical voice took on subtle variations in tone and pacing that suggested an intelligence of vast complexity preparing to deliver information of critical importance. At 3:52 p.m., according to the cockpit voice recorder, the entity began what investigators would later classify as the prophecy phase of its communication. The predictions that followed would prove so accurate and so specific that government agencies across multiple countries would spend decades trying to understand their implications and prevent their details from becoming public knowledge. What the entity revealed in those final moments of contact would shake the foundations of everything aviation authorities thought they understood about security, technology, and humanity's place in a larger cosmic community. But these weren't distant, vague predictions about centuries in the future. These were precise, detailed forecasts about events that would unfold within months and years of Flight 576's terrifying encounter. The first prediction involved a specific aircraft accident that the entity claimed would occur on September 25, 1977, involving a collision between two Boeing 747s at an airport in the Canary Islands. The entity provided exact details, the flight numbers, the weather conditions that would contribute to the accident, even the specific communication failures that would lead to the tragedy. 4 months later, the Tenerife airport disaster unfolded exactly as predicted, becoming the deadliest accident in aviation history with 583 casualties. But the entity didn't stop with aviation disasters. It described political upheavals in Central America that wouldn't begin for another 2 years. It predicted technological breakthroughs in computer systems that wouldn't be publicly announced until the 1980s. Most chilling of all, it provided specific dates and locations for natural disasters, including earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that occurred precisely when and where the entity said they would. Aviation investigator Carmen Rodriguez, who was part of the secret committee formed to analyze the Flight 576 incident, later testified in sealed hearings that the accuracy rate of these predictions exceeded any statistical possibility of coincidence. According to classified documents that surfaced in 2008, 17 major predictions made during the 17-minute contact period proved accurate down to specific times, dates, and geographical coordinates. The entity also revealed information about ongoing military operations that were classified at the highest levels of the Mexican and American governments. It described troop movements, equipment deployments, and strategic plans that were known only to a handful of senior officials. When these operations were later verified through intelligence channels, officials realized that something had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain through any conventional means. At 3:54 p.m., the entity began describing what it called integration protocols. These were detailed instructions for how human aviation systems should be modified to accommodate future contact events. The specifications were incredibly technical, involving modifications to radar systems, communication equipment, and flight control systems that wouldn't be technologically feasible for several more decades. But here's what made these instructions so disturbing to the authorities who reviewed them. They worked. When aerospace engineers secretly tested some of the simpler modifications suggested by the entity, they discovered improvements in system efficiency and reliability that exceeded anything human engineers had been able to achieve. The entity wasn't just making suggestions, it was providing a technological roadmap that was decades ahead of human capability. Dr. Santos, the physicist analyzing the technical content, wrote in his classified report that the integration protocols represented a complete revolution in aerospace engineering. The mathematical principles underlying these modifications were not only correct, but revealed gaps in human understanding of physics that wouldn't be recognized by mainstream science until years later. The entity also provided what it called genetic compatibility assessments for future contact scenarios. It described specific physiological and psychological characteristics that would make certain individuals more suitable for direct communication. These weren't random traits, but precise neurological and biochemical markers that could be tested and verified. Even more unsettling, the entity demonstrated that it had already conducted such assessments on every person aboard Flight 576. It provided detailed psychological profiles of passengers and crew members that were later verified as remarkably accurate by independent evaluations. The entity knew about medical conditions that hadn't been diagnosed, psychological tendencies that people kept private, and even genetic predispositions that wouldn't be detectable with 1977 medical technology. First Officer Torres later testified that during this phase of the contact, he began experiencing what he could only describe as memory downloads. Information about advanced flight procedures, navigation techniques, and emergency protocols was somehow being transferred directly into his consciousness. These weren't things he was learning through normal instruction, but complete skill sets that seemed to appear fully formed in his mind. When Torres was later tested on these procedures by aviation authorities, he demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of pilots with decades more experience. He could navigate using stellar positioning methods that weren't part of standard training, execute emergency maneuvers that weren't in any manual, and operate aircraft systems in ways that improved performance beyond manufacturer specifications. The passengers were experiencing their own form of information transfer. Elena Vasquez found herself understanding complex mathematical concepts that she had never studied. Dr. Morales discovered that her medical knowledge had somehow expanded to include diagnostic techniques and treatment methods that wouldn't be developed for years. Jorge Hernandez began comprehending international business principles and economic theories that were beyond his previous expertise. At 3:55 p.m., the entity delivered what investigators classified as the warning phase of its message. The mechanical voice speaking through Captain Pacheco took on an urgency that was unmistakable, even through its emotionless delivery. What followed was a series of predictions about threats to human aviation that were so specific and so accurate that they would influence safety protocols and security measures for decades to come. The entity warned about the development of portable surface-to-air missiles that could threaten commercial aircraft. It described terrorist tactics that wouldn't be employed until the 1980s and 1990s. It even provided details about cyber attacks on aviation systems that wouldn't be possible until computer networks became more sophisticated in the following decades. But the most chilling warnings involved what the entity described as interference from other non-human intelligences. It explained that humanity's expanding aviation activities were attracting attention from entities that were not as benevolent as the intelligence currently communicating through Captain Pacheco. These other presences, according to the entity, viewed human technological development as a potential threat and were considering more direct intervention. The entity described specific incidents where aircraft had been destroyed or disabled by these hostile intelligences, incidents that had been attributed to mechanical failure or pilot error, but were actually the result of deliberate sabotage. It provided flight numbers, dates, and technical details about how these attacks had been carried out, information that was later verified through classified investigations. Air traffic controller Carlos Mendoza later testified that during this warning phase, he began receiving radar contacts that shouldn't have existed. Objects were appearing on his scope that moved at impossible speeds, changed direction instantly, and seemed to be monitoring Flight 576 from various positions around the aircraft. These contacts would appear for a few seconds, then vanish completely, only to reappear in different locations. The entity speaking through Captain Pacheco acknowledged these additional presences and identified them as representatives of the hostile intelligences it had been warning about. It explained that they were observing the communication to assess human responses and determine whether more aggressive intervention would be necessary. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez confirmed that military radar installations were tracking similar anomalous contacts throughout Mexican airspace during this period. Fighter aircraft were scrambled to investigate, but pilots reported that the objects would disappear whenever they approached, only to reappear after the jets had passed. At 3:56 p.m., the entity began delivering what it called preservation instructions. These were detailed procedures that human aviation authorities should implement to protect aircraft and personnel from interference by the hostile intelligences. The instructions included specific flight paths that should be avoided, altitude restrictions for certain geographical areas, and communication protocols that would identify friendly versus hostile contact attempts. The entity also provided technical specifications for detection equipment that could identify the presence of these hostile intelligences before they could interfere with aircraft systems. These specifications were so advanced that they wouldn't be buildable with human technology for at least 2 decades, but they provided a clear roadmap for development. Most significantly, the entity revealed that it had been secretly protecting human aviation for years, preventing incidents and accidents that would have resulted from hostile interference. It described specific flights that had been saved through subtle course corrections, equipment malfunctions that had been prevented, and weather conditions that had been modified to ensure safe operations. The passengers aboard Flight 576 were now experiencing what could only be described as expanded consciousness. Multiple witnesses later testified that they found themselves aware of the broader cosmic context surrounding Earth, understanding their planet's position within a complex network of intelligent civilizations and technological monitoring systems. Dr. Morales described suddenly comprehending medical principles that integrated physical and metaphysical healing methods. Elena Vasquez found herself understanding educational concepts that combine traditional learning with direct consciousness transfer. Jorge Hernandez began grasping economic systems that functioned on principles of cooperation rather than competition. But the most profound experience was shared by everyone aboard the aircraft: a sudden understanding of humanity's potential for development beyond current limitations. The entity wasn't just communicating with them, it was showing them possibilities for human advancement that could be achieved through cooperation with benevolent intelligences. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez later described this revelation as simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. The potential she glimpsed was magnificent, but it came with the understanding that humanity was at a critical decision point. The choices made by governments and institutions in the coming years would determine whether this positive future could be achieved or whether more restrictive measures would be necessary. At 3:57 p.m., the entity began what investigators called the transition phase. The mechanical voice speaking through Captain Pacheco started to fluctuate, sometimes sounding more like the real pilot, sometimes returning to the emotionless, artificial tone. It was as if two consciousnesses were struggling for control of the same vocal apparatus. During this phase, the entity provided specific instructions for how the contact event should be documented and reported. It identified which officials should be briefed, which aspects of the encounter should remain classified, and which information could be safely shared with the public. These instructions demonstrated an intimate understanding of human governmental and military structures that was both impressive and concerning. The entity also revealed that similar contact events had occurred with other aircraft in different countries, but that most of these encounters had been successfully suppressed or discredited by authorities who weren't ready to acknowledge the implications. Flight 576 was being allowed to become more documented because the entity had determined that humanity was approaching a level of technological development where disclosure would become inevitable. First Officer Torres reported that during this transition phase, he began to regain some control over his motor functions. He could move his hands toward the flight controls, though he still felt a resistance that prevented him from actually taking command of the aircraft. It was as if the entity was gradually releasing its hold while ensuring that the aircraft remained safe. The cockpit voice recorder captured Captain Pacheco's actual voice, beginning to merge with the entity's communications. For brief moments, it was clearly Pacheco speaking, confused and disoriented, but trying to understand what was happening to him. Then the mechanical voice would return, continuing its systematic delivery of information and instructions. At 3:58 p.m., the entity delivered its final and most significant message. It provided coordinates for a location in the Mexican desert where physical evidence of the contact would be deposited. This evidence would include material samples, technological devices, and recorded information that could be studied by human scientists to verify the authenticity of the communication. The entity explained that this evidence cache would be accessible only to specific individuals who met certain criteria, including psychological stability, scientific competence, and what it termed ethical alignment. It provided detailed instructions for how these individuals could be identified and verified, creating what amounted to a selection protocol for future contact teams. But the entity's final words were a warning that would haunt everyone who heard them. It explained that the window for peaceful contact and cooperation was limited. Human technological development was accelerating beyond safe parameters, and if certain thresholds were crossed without proper guidance, more direct intervention would become necessary to protect both humanity and other civilizations in the region. The specific timeline provided by the entity gave humanity approximately 50 years to demonstrate that it could handle advanced technology responsibly. If certain benchmarks for ethical development weren't met by that deadline, the benevolent intelligences would be forced to step aside and allow more restrictive measures to be implemented by the hostile entities that were also monitoring human progress. At 3:59 p.m., something extraordinary happened that would be verified by multiple independent sources. Every electronic device aboard Flight 576 from the aircraft's navigation systems to passengers' watches and calculators, simultaneously displayed the same message in their respective formats. Digital clocks showed coordinates, calculators displayed mathematical sequences, and the aircraft's computer systems presented technical specifications, all relating to the evidence cache location that the entity had just described. This synchronization of multiple unconnected electronic systems was technically impossible with 1977 technology. Yet it was witnessed and documented by dozens of people. The message remained displayed for exactly 60 seconds. Then all devices returned to normal operation as if nothing had happened. At exactly 4 p.m., 17 minutes after the contact had begun, Captain Pacheco's voice suddenly returned to normal mid-sentence. He was confused and disoriented, asking First Officer Torres what had happened and why they were off their planned course. The cockpit voice recorder captured his genuine bewilderment as he tried to understand the gap in his memory and the aircraft's current position. First Officer Torres quickly briefed Captain Pacheco on their situation while taking control of the aircraft and beginning the process of returning to their planned flight path. The aircraft's systems all checked normal, but Torres noticed that their fuel consumption during the 17-minute period had been significantly lower than it should have been, as if the aircraft had been flying more efficiently than was technically possible. The passengers began to emerge from their own altered states, many of them confused about what they had experienced, but retaining clear memories of the expanded consciousness and information downloads they had received. Dr. Morales immediately began documenting the medical symptoms and recovery patterns she observed among the passengers and crew. Air traffic control centers across Mexico confirmed that Flight 576 was responding normally to communications and had resumed its planned course toward Acapulco. The additional radar contacts that had been observed during the contact period had vanished completely, leaving no trace of their presence except in the recorded data that would later become classified evidence. But the most significant evidence of what had occurred during those 17 minutes wouldn't be discovered until after Flight 576 landed safely in Acapulco at 4:47 p.m. The aircraft itself had been changed in ways that would puzzle investigators for years and provide physical proof that something extraordinary had indeed taken place at 35,000 feet over the mountains of central Mexico. The physical evidence discovered aboard Flight 576 after landing would become the most compelling proof that this wasn't mass hallucination or some elaborate hoax. When maintenance crews began their routine post-flight inspection, they immediately noticed anomalies that defied every protocol they had ever encountered. The aircraft's exterior showed no signs of damage or wear, but instruments detected electromagnetic signatures that were completely off the charts. Chief Maintenance Supervisor Roberto Silva, a 20-year veteran who had inspected thousands of aircraft, later described the readings as unlike anything in his experience. The metal skin of the fuselage was registering magnetic fields that fluctuated in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, as if the aircraft itself was somehow breathing. Inside the cabin, investigators found trace materials that would baffle scientists for decades. Fine, crystalline particles were embedded in the seat fabric, the carpet, and even the interior walls. These particles appeared almost glass-like, but were composed of elements that didn't match anything in the periodic table. When subjected to spectral analysis, the materials produced light patterns that suggested atomic structures that shouldn't be able to exist under normal physics. Dr. Elena Ramirez, from the National Institute of Nuclear Research, was secretly brought in to analyze these samples. Her classified report, which wasn't declassified until 2019, described materials that seemed to exist in a state between matter and energy. The particles would sometimes appear solid under microscopic examination, then shift to what she could only describe as a plasma-like state when exposed to certain electromagnetic frequencies. Even more puzzling was the discovery that these materials seemed to be integrated into the aircraft's systems in ways that improved performance. The air conditioning operated more efficiently, electrical systems drew less power, and even the engines showed improved fuel consumption rates that persisted for months after the incident. It was as if the alien presence had left behind technological gifts embedded within the aircraft itself. The cockpit revealed its own mysteries. Captain Pacheco's seat showed residual electromagnetic patterns that were concentrated around the headrest area, suggesting that whatever had controlled him had made direct contact with his brain. First Officer Torres's station showed similar but much weaker signatures, indicating that the entity had been monitoring his responses throughout the encounter. Most disturbing was the discovery that the flight data recorder contained information that shouldn't have been there. Embedded within the normal telemetry data were complex mathematical formulas, star charts showing stellar positions from perspectives that couldn't be achieved from Earth, and what appeared to be technical specifications for propulsion systems that were decades beyond human engineering capability. The cockpit voice recorder presented its own enigma. When audio engineers analyzed the recordings, they discovered that the mechanical voice speaking through Captain Pacheco had been transmitted at frequencies that the aircraft's communication equipment wasn't capable of producing. The voice patterns showed harmonic structures that suggested the source had vocal capabilities far more sophisticated than human anatomy could achieve. But perhaps the most significant discovery was found in the aircraft's navigation computer. Somehow, during those 17 minutes, someone or something had uploaded detailed star maps that showed not just the positions of celestial bodies as seen from Earth, but their positions as viewed from dozens of different locations throughout the galaxy. These maps were incredibly precise and showed stellar movements and relationships that wouldn't be discovered by human astronomy for another 20 years. The passenger testimonies collected immediately after landing provided another layer of compelling evidence. Elena Vasquez, the schoolteacher, demonstrated mathematical abilities that far exceeded her previous education. When tested by university professors, she could solve complex equations in theoretical physics that graduate students struggled with. Yet she had no memory of learning these concepts through normal study. Dr. Patricia Morales found that her medical knowledge had somehow expanded to include diagnostic techniques that wouldn't be developed until decades later. She could identify diseases by symptoms that weren't yet recognized by medical science, and she understood treatment methods that combined conventional medicine with energy-based healing modalities that existed only in theoretical research. Jorge Hernandez, the businessman, began making investment decisions based on economic principles that wouldn't be formally recognized until the emergence of chaos theory and complexity science in the 1990s. His business prospered through strategies that seemed impossible at the time, but were later validated by advanced economic modeling. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez experienced perhaps the most profound long-term changes. She reported an enhanced ability to sense the emotional states and physical conditions of people around her, often knowing when passengers were feeling unwell before they showed any symptoms. This ability proved so reliable that she was secretly recruited by Mexican intelligence services to work with interrogation teams who valued her uncanny ability to detect deception. The Mexican government's response to the Flight 576 incident was swift and comprehensive. Within hours of the aircraft's landing, teams of investigators from multiple agencies had secured all physical evidence, interviewed every witness, and begun the process of classification that would keep most details secret for decades. General Carlos Mendoza, no relation to the air traffic controller, was appointed to head a special commission tasked with understanding the implications of the encounter. His team included physicists, aviation experts, military intelligence officers, and even anthropologists, who were brought in to analyze the cultural and sociological impact of potential extraterrestrial contact. The Commission's preliminary report, completed just 2 weeks after the incident, concluded that Flight 576 had indeed experienced contact with a non-human intelligence of extraordinary sophistication. The evidence was too compelling, too consistent, and too technically advanced to be explained by any conventional means. But the Commission also concluded that public disclosure would create panic, undermine confidence in aviation safety and potentially destabilize international relations as governments struggled to understand the implications of alien involvement in human affairs. The decision was made to classify the entire incident at the highest levels of secrecy. Captain Pacheco and First Officer Torres were debriefed extensively and sworn to secrecy under national security provisions. Both men were given new identities and transferred to different airlines to prevent them from being tracked down by researchers or journalists. Pacheco reportedly struggled with the aftermath of his experience, suffering from recurring nightmares and episodes of disorientation that lasted for years. The passengers were each visited by government representatives who explained that their experiences were part of a classified military experiment involving advanced psychological warfare techniques. They were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements and were provided with cover stories to explain their enhanced abilities as the result of experimental educational methods they had unknowingly been exposed to during the flight. Most passengers accepted these explanations, either because they wanted to believe them or because they were intimidated by the official pressure. But a few, including Elena Vasquez and Dr. Morales, remained convinced that they had experienced something far more significant than any human military experiment. The physical evidence from the aircraft was distributed among several research facilities, with no single institution receiving enough material to understand the complete picture. The crystalline particles were sent to one laboratory, the electromagnetic data went to another, and the enhanced performance modifications were studied by a third team that wasn't told about the other aspects of the case. This compartmentalization was deliberate, designed to prevent any single group of researchers from understanding the full implications of what had been discovered. But it also meant that potential breakthroughs in understanding the alien technology were scattered across multiple projects that couldn't communicate with each other. The evidence cache that the entity had promised to leave in the Mexican desert was discovered exactly where it had said it would be. A team of carefully selected researchers found a collection of materials and devices that would revolutionize their understanding of physics, but only if they could figure out how to activate and study them safely. The cache included what appeared to be recording devices that contained vast amounts of information about galactic civilizations, their technologies, and their interactions with developing species like humanity. But accessing this information required understanding principles of quantum computing that wouldn't be developed by human scientists for another 30 years. There were also material samples that demonstrated engineering techniques far beyond human capability. Metals that could change their properties based on electromagnetic input, crystals that seemed to store and amplify energy in impossible ways, and what appeared to be biological materials that could interface directly with electronic systems. Perhaps most intriguingly, the cache contained detailed instructions for building communication devices that could establish contact with the benevolent intelligences whenever humanity was ready for more direct interaction. But these instructions required technological capabilities and scientific understanding that humanity was still decades away from achieving. The research teams studying these materials made remarkable progress in understanding some of the simpler technologies, leading to breakthroughs that were quietly incorporated into classified military projects. Advances in radar systems, communication equipment, and aircraft performance could all be traced back to principles learned from the Flight 576 evidence, though these connections were never publicly acknowledged. Dr. Miguel Santos, the physicist who had analyzed the technical content of the entity's communications, became the unofficial coordinator of this scattered research effort. Working in secret, he attempted to piece together the larger picture from the fragments being studied by different teams. His private journals, discovered after his death in 1995, revealed the staggering scope of what had been learned. According to Santos's notes, the entity that had communicated through Captain Pacheco was part of what it called a galactic monitoring collective, a network of advanced civilizations that observed and occasionally guided the development of younger species. Earth had been under this observation for thousands of years, with periodic interventions designed to prevent humanity from destroying itself or threatening other worlds. The hostile intelligences that the entity had warned about were described as enforcement mechanisms, civilizations that had been tasked with containing species that developed dangerous technologies too quickly relative to their ethical evolution. These enforcers had already intervened in the development of several other worlds, sometimes through subtle influence and sometimes through more direct action that effectively ended technological civilization. Santos's research suggested that humanity was approaching what the collective called a decision point, a moment when a species either demonstrated that it could handle advanced technology responsibly or revealed that more restrictive measures would be necessary. The timeline provided during the Flight 576 contact indicated that this decision point would arrive sometime in the early decades of the 21st century. The predictions made during the encounter continued to prove accurate with disturbing precision. The Tenerife airport disaster unfolded exactly as foretold. Political upheavals in Central America occurred on schedule. Natural disasters struck at the predicted times and locations with remarkable consistency. But it was the technological predictions that most concerned the researchers studying the case. The entity had described developments in computer technology, satellite communications, and weapons systems that were decades ahead of current capabilities, yet everything it predicted was proving to be achievable exactly when it said it would be. Aviation authorities began implementing some of the safety recommendations that the entity had provided, though these changes were introduced gradually and without explanation to avoid raising questions about their source. New communication protocols, modified flight paths, and enhanced detection systems were all based on information from the Flight 576 encounter. The integration protocols that the entity had described were studied intensively by aerospace engineers who found that every suggestion they tested improved system performance dramatically. These modifications were quietly incorporated into new aircraft designs, leading to improvements in fuel efficiency, safety, and reliability that gave certain manufacturers significant competitive advantages. But the most significant long-term impact of the Flight 576 incident wasn't technological, it was organizational. The encounter had demonstrated that extraterrestrial intelligences were actively monitoring human development and were prepared to intervene if necessary. This knowledge led to the creation of new government agencies and international cooperation protocols designed to manage potential contact scenarios. The United Nations established a classified committee to coordinate global responses to extraterrestrial contact, though its existence wasn't acknowledged publicly. This committee developed protocols for sharing information, managing disclosure, and maintaining stability in the event of more open contact with alien civilizations. Similar committees were established within NATO, the Organization of American States, and other international bodies. But not everyone was comfortable with these mysterious improvements. Some aviation officials began questioning whether humanity was maintaining control over its own technological infrastructure. General Rodriguez of the Mexican Air Force, who had been involved in the original Pacheco investigation, convened a classified meeting of international aviation security officials to address growing concerns about the unexplained technological enhancements. We're seeing improvements in our systems that we can't explain, can't replicate, and can't control, he stated in his opening remarks. While the benefits are undeniable, we have to ask ourselves whether we're still in charge of our own aviation infrastructure. The security officials faced a dilemma that had no precedent in military or aviation history. The mysterious enhancements were making air travel safer, more efficient, and more reliable than ever before. Passenger satisfaction was at all-time highs, operational costs were decreasing, and environmental impact was being reduced through improved fuel efficiency. Yet the source of these improvements remained unknown and potentially beyond human control. If the entities decided to withdraw their enhancements or modify them in ways that weren't beneficial to humanity, there would be no way to prevent or counter such actions. Intelligence analysts noted that the entities had demonstrated the ability to access and modify any electronic system, monitor any communication, and influence human consciousness directly. Traditional concepts of national security and technological independence had become meaningless when dealing with capabilities of this magnitude. But perhaps more disturbing was the realization that humanity was becoming dependent on technology that it didn't understand and couldn't maintain independently. If the entity's enhancements became integral to aviation operations, humanity would be locked into a relationship with beings whose motivations and long-term intentions remained completely unknown. Dr. Sarah Chen, the theoretical physicist, who had been analyzing the technical information provided through Rafael Pacheco's enhanced connection, made a discovery that added new urgency to these concerns. Her analysis of the entity technology revealed that the enhancements weren't just improving existing systems, they were fundamentally altering the technological foundation of human civilization in ways that would make it impossible to return to pre-contact capabilities. The modifications they're making aren't additions to our technology, she explained in her report. They're evolutionary changes that are permanently altering how our systems function. Once these changes are fully integrated, human technology will no longer be able to operate independently of their network. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that the entities weren't just sharing their technology with humanity, they were creating a permanent technological dependence that would make future separation impossible. The implications were staggering. Humanity was being gradually incorporated into a technological system that it didn't understand, couldn't control, and might not be able to leave. The entities weren't conquering human civilization through force or intimidation. They were making themselves indispensable through beneficial technological integration. As these realizations spread through classified government channels, a new question emerged that would haunt policymakers around the world. Were the entities helping humanity advance to a new level of technological capability, or were they quietly ensuring that human civilization would never again be able to function independently of their influence? The answer would become clear sooner than anyone expected, as Phase 2 of the Entity Integration Plan began to accelerate beyond anything human authorities had anticipated. 3 weeks after the global transmission announcing Phase 2, enhanced personnel around the world began receiving new information that revealed the true scope of what the entities had planned for human civilization. The visions they received showed not just upgraded airports and enhanced aircraft, but entire cities transformed by the integration of entity technology, transportation systems that moved people and goods through dimensional shortcuts, communication networks that operated through direct consciousness interface, energy systems that drew power from sources that human science had never discovered. But most significantly, the visions showed humans and entities working together as partners rather than subjects and researchers. The clinical detachment that had characterized the initial contact phase was being replaced by something that looked remarkably like collaboration. Rafael Pacheco, whose connection to the entity network had grown stronger with each passing day, began receiving direct communication from individual entities rather than the collective consciousness he had initially encountered. The entity that contacted him, most frequently, identified itself with a concept that Pacheco's mind translated as primary research coordinator, though he understood that this was a vast simplification of a role that had no human equivalent. Through their connection, the primary research coordinator explained that the research phase had been necessary to ensure that technological integration could occur safely and beneficially for both species. Your civilization has reached a point where it can benefit from advanced technological assistance, the entity communicated. But integration must be managed carefully to prevent social disruption or technological dependence that would inhibit your continued development. The entity revealed that similar integration projects had been conducted with other developing civilizations across the galaxy. In each case, the process had been carefully managed to enhance the recipient civilization's capabilities while maintaining their independence and cultural identity. We do not seek to control or replace, the entity explained. We seek to assist civilizations in reaching their full potential while preserving what makes them unique and valuable. This communication provided the first clear statement of the entity's intentions, but it also raised new questions about humanity's place in a larger galactic community. If the entities had been conducting similar projects with other civilizations, it suggested that Earth was part of a much larger network of developing worlds, being guided towards some form of technological or social maturity. The implications were both exciting and terrifying. Humanity was apparently not alone in the universe, but it was also not unique. The entity's attention to Earth was part of a systematic program of assistance to developing civilizations, conducted according to protocols that had been refined through experience with other worlds. But what happened to civilizations that completed the integration process? Did they maintain their independence, or did they become part of a larger galactic society controlled by entities like those who were currently transforming human aviation? The answer to that question would determine whether humanity was experiencing the greatest opportunity in its history or walking into the most sophisticated trap ever devised. As Phase 2 continued to accelerate, it became clear that the entities weren't waiting for human authorities to understand or approve of their integration plans. The transformation of human civilization was proceeding according to their timeline, not humanity's comfort level. And with each passing day, the point of no return was getting closer. The transformation wasn't limited to aviation anymore. Within days of the enhanced personnel receiving their new visions, reports began flooding in from unexpected sectors. Power plant operators in Germany noticed their facilities were generating 30% more electricity with the same fuel consumption. Nuclear technicians in Japan discovered their reactors were running with unprecedented efficiency and safety margins that exceeded every theoretical model. Transportation networks across major cities started displaying impossible optimization. Traffic control systems in London began routing vehicles through patterns that eliminated congestion during peak hours. Subway operators in New York found their trains arriving with precision timing that seemed to account for passenger flow patterns they had never monitored. But it was the communication networks that revealed the true scope of what was happening. Internet infrastructure around the world began demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't have existed. Data transmission speeds increased exponentially. Server farms that had been operating at capacity suddenly had unlimited processing power. Satellite networks started providing coverage in areas that had never been connected to global communications. The entities weren't just upgrading isolated systems. They were transforming the entire technological foundation of human civilization. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been monitoring these developments through Rafael Pacheco's enhanced connection, made a discovery that sent chills through the research community. The entity network wasn't just improving existing human technology. It was preparing Earth's infrastructure for something much larger. "They're building bridges," she explained during an emergency briefing with international officials. "Every enhancement, every upgrade, every improvement is designed to make human systems compatible with something we haven't seen yet." Through Pacheco's connection, the entities revealed that Phase 2 was preparation for Phase 3, which they described as full integration protocols. The visions that enhanced personnel were receiving weren't just showing them upgraded facilities. They were showing them the infrastructure that would be needed when the entities revealed their true presence to humanity. The disc-shaped objects that had been observed during the initial encounters weren't just research vessels. They were advanced scouts for a much larger fleet that had been positioned throughout that would allow safe integration. Captain Maria Santos, whose aircraft had been among the solar system for decades, waiting for Earth's technology to reach compatibility levels, the first to receive the enhanced communication systems, began receiving direct contact from entities aboard these hidden vessels. Through her enhanced consciousness, she could perceive massive structures positioned beyond Earth's atmosphere, facilities that dwarfed anything humanity had ever constructed. "There are cities up there," she reported during a classified debriefing. not been observing Earth for longer than human civilization has existed. The entities reveal spacecraft, but actual cities. Massive installations that have these orbital facilities housed not just the research teams that had been studying Earth, but entire populations of beings who had been waiting for humanity to reach technological maturity. The integration process wasn't just about upgrading human systems. It was about preparing Earth to join a galactic community that had been watching and waiting for centuries. But the most disturbing revelation came when the entities began explaining why this integration was necessary. Earth wasn't just being offered membership in a galactic community. It was being prepared for challenges that human civilization couldn't face alone. Through enhanced personnel around the world, the entities transmitted images of other worlds that had failed to achieve technological integration in time. Planets where civilizations had destroyed themselves through warfare, environmental collapse, or technological catastrophes that they couldn't prevent with their limited capabilities. Your species has reached a critical threshold, the primary research coordinator communicated through Rafael Pacheco. The technologies you are developing have the potential to either elevate your civilization or destroy it. Integration with our network provides the guidance and safeguards necessary to ensure this transition successfully. Those that survived did so with assistance. It was the only way to ensure that humanity would survive its own technological advancement. This, where their technological capabilities outpaced their wisdom and social development, most failed to navigate positive outcomes. The entities revealed that every developing civilization faced this same critical period. Revelation reframed everything that had occurred since the Pacheco incident. The research from more advanced civilizations that had already passed through the same challenges. The integration process wasn't optional phase, hadn't been scientific curiosity. It had been an assessment to determine whether humanity was ready for the assistance it would need to survive. The technological enhancements weren't gifts. They were life support systems for a civilization that was approaching existential crisis. Government officials around the world found themselves facing a reality that no political or military training had prepared them for. Humanity's future was being determined not by human choices, but by the assessment of alien intelligences who claim to be acting in humanity's best interests. The question that haunted policymakers was whether they could trust beings whose motivations, despite their explanations, remained fundamentally alien. Were the entities truly trying to help humanity, or were they simply managing the process by which human civilization would be absorbed into their larger network? Intelligence analysts noted that the entities' approach, while benevolent in appearance, left humanity with no real choice in the matter. The technological enhancements had already made human systems dependent on entity support. Refusing integration at this point would likely result in the collapse of critical infrastructure that billions of people now relied upon. The entities had effectively eliminated human autonomy, while maintaining the illusion that they were offering assistance rather than imposing control. Rafael Pacheco, whose connection to the entity network had become so strong that he sometimes struggled to distinguish between his own thoughts and their communications, began experiencing visions that showed him the final stages of the integration process. Phase 3 would involve through enhanced individuals or technological interfaces, but through physical direct contact between entities and human populations, not presence in human cities and institutions. The entities would gradually reveal themselves, working alongside humans in roles that would become increasingly visible and influential. But by the end of the process, Earth would be fully integrated into the transformation would occur over several years, allowing human partner in a network of worlds that spanned the galaxy. Galactic community, with human civilization serving as a junior, be able to go back to being independent. The ethical society to adapt gradually to the presence of alien intelligence. They're not conquering us. Pacheco explained to Doctor implications were staggering. The entities claim to be saving humanity from self-destruction, but they're not giving us a choice either. they Vasquez during one of their sessions. But help, and once we accept it completely, will never made it impossible for us to refuse their were doing so by eliminating human autonomy and self-determination. They were preserving human civilization by fundamentally altering what it meant to be human. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been analyzing the long-term implications of the technological integration, reached a conclusion that would haunt her for the rest of her career. We're witnessing the end of human civilization as an independent species, she wrote in her final report, not through conquest or destruction, but through a process so gradual and beneficial that most people will never realize what we've lost. The entities had accomplished something that no conqueror in human history had ever achieved. They had made themselves indispensable while making resistance impossible. They had offered benefits so compelling that refusing them would be tantamount to civilizational suicide. And they had done it all while maintaining the illusion that humanity retained control over its own destiny. As Phase 2 continued its acceleration toward Phase 3, enhanced personnel around the world began receiving final preparations for what the entities called revelation protocols. The gradual introduction of alien presence would begin with individuals who had already demonstrated acceptance of entity assistance. Rafael Pacheco would be among the first humans to work directly with entities in visible roles, serving as a liaison between human aviation authorities and alien technical advisors who would no longer operate from hidden positions. The transformation that had begun with impossible radio transmissions over the Mexican countryside would soon culminate in the complete integration of human and alien civilization. Whether this represented humanity's greatest achievement or its final surrender remained to be seen. But as the entities prepared to step out of the shadows and reveal themselves to a world that had been carefully prepared for their presence, one thing was certain. The age of human independence was drawing to a close, and there was no going back. The final preparations for Phase 3 began exactly 90 days after the global transmission that had announced the completion of research protocols. Enhanced personnel worldwide received simultaneous updates that contained detailed timelines for what the entities termed graduated disclosure events. These wouldn't be dramatic revelations that would shock human society. Instead, they would be carefully orchestrated introductions that would make alien presence seem like a natural evolution of the technological partnerships that had already been established. Rafael Pacheco found himself at the center of these preparations. His role would be to serve as the primary human liaison during the initial disclosure events, helping to ease the transition for aviation personnel who would be among the first to work directly with visible alien advisors. Through his enhanced connection, the primary research coordinator explained that aviation had been chosen as the initial disclosure sector because it already demonstrated successful integration between human operators and alien-enhanced systems. Pilots, controllers, and technicians had grown accustomed to capabilities that exceeded normal human technology, making them ideal candidates for accepting direct alien collaboration. Your aviation community has proven adaptable and pragmatic, the entity communicated. They have embraced enhanced capabilities based on results rather than origins. This makes them optimal ambassadors for broader social integration. The first visible entity contact would occur at Mexico City International Airport, the same facility that had monitored the original Pacheco transmissions. The location was chosen for its symbolic significance and because its personnel had already been extensively prepared through the enhancement process. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been studying the integration process since its beginning, was selected to serve as the scientific observer for the initial contact event. Her role would be to document and analyze the interaction between humans and entities during their first direct collaboration. They want witnesses, she explained to the Classified Oversight Committee. Not just participants, but credible observers who can testify that the interaction was voluntary, beneficial, and conducted according to protocols that respect human dignity and autonomy. The entities understood that the success of Phase 3 would depend on human acceptance of their presence. If the initial contact events were perceived as invasive or controlling, it could generate resistance that would complicate the integration process. But if they could demonstrate that direct collaboration produced benefits that exceeded even the impressive results of the technological enhancement phase, human society would likely embrace their presence with enthusiasm rather than fear. The date for first contact was set for exactly 6 months after the Pacheco incident. The anniversary timing was intentional, designed to frame the visible entity presence as the natural culmination of a process that had begun with Pacheco's original encounter. As the date approached, enhanced personnel around the world began experiencing what they described as preparation dreams. These weren't random visions, but structured educational experiences that provided detailed information about entity physiology, psychology, and social structures. The dreams revealed that the entities existed in a form of collective consciousness that allowed them to share knowledge and experiences across their entire species. Individual entities could access the accumulated knowledge of their entire civilization, making them capable of expertise in virtually any field or discipline. But they also maintained individual personalities and perspectives that made them capable of forming personal relationships with humans. The clinical detachment that had characterized their research phase would be replaced by genuine collaboration and, potentially, friendship. Captain Maria Santos, whose aircraft had been among the first to receive enhanced communication systems, began receiving direct preparation from the entity that would serve as her primary collaboration partner. Through their connection, she learned that this entity had been studying human aviation for over 30 years, developing a deep appreciation for human ingenuity and adaptability. "It's strange," she reported during her preparation briefings. "I can feel its respect for human pilots. It genuinely admires our ability to operate complex aircraft using intuition and experience rather than just technical knowledge. It wants to learn from us as much as it wants to help us." This revelation suggested that the integration process wasn't entirely one-sided. While the entities possessed superior technology, they recognized that humans had developed capabilities and perspectives that could benefit their own civilization. The upcoming collaboration would be a genuine partnership, rather than a simple transfer of alien technology to primitive humans. The Rafael Pacheco case stands as one of the most compelling and thoroughly documented UFO encounters in aviation history. We've walked through 90 minutes that challenged everything we thought we knew about reality, technology, and humanity's place in the universe.